So there are three R words in comics that I think every fan of comics, big two comics anyway, has a relationship with. And those are reboot, retcon, and resurrection. Everybody has their thoughts and opinions on those three things. And you know what? Not everybody's opinion about those three things is consistent just within that person. You might
Yeah.
love a reboot, but you hate a retcon, for example. You might love a resurrection, but you can't stand a reboot. So to me, I feel like those are controversial terms that not everybody even necessarily uses appropriately within this space. So I want to kind of define them and talk about how we feel about them and how those things affect our engagement with Big Two Comics.
So, should we tackle them one by one? Is my question.
Let's start with the reboot.
Okay.
Reboot a New 52 type.
It's what you do every night, Marco.
That's right. That's right. Put in that mindset.
All right, so let's define a reboot. In my mind, a reboot is either one of two things. It's either a hard reboot where you are literally starting from scratch with the same essential ideas of the characters, but basically starting flat with them. And then you have a soft reboot, which is when you're starting at one-ish, but there's a lot of things that might have been retained. What I consider to be a soft reboot, or rather, what I consider to be a hard reboot, is something like the New 52, where, with almost no exception, Batman and Green Lantern being the outliers, they started everybody at one.
Hardish reboot.
Yeah, hardish. Harder than a soft one. We're talking like nearly full mast here for a reboot.
6 to midnight, yeah.
Whereas like what happens after Secret Wars 2015 is not a reboot. Not even a soft one, because it generally continues from what was happening before in Marvel, even if it is the start of a new sort of age.
Marvel has traditionally not done reboots. It's mostly been relaunches. I think of reboots and I think of like a post-crisis thing. Because even like John Byrne's Man of Steel is kind of a soft reboot of Superman.
Well, let's argue about this, because I would say Marvel does more soft reboots than hard ones. And I would look at, I think the Secret Wars stuff is a good example of that. I would also say something like the all new, all different line when that came out. I would think that would be sort of a softer reboot.
But it's not. See, to me, in my mind, a reboot requires the denial of the past. It requires you to say, okay, these things did not happen. They just didn't. And now you have to accept this new thing that is happening. And to my knowledge, there's never been a time at which Marvel has said, okay, we are denying these things. These things are not a part of our history anymore.
Marvel is much more of a retconner, but I feel like DC is more of a rebooter.
That's still a continuous timeline, straightforward, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Marvel gets they get it off by doing things like, Marvel 2099 or, Earth X. They find all these different ways to present their characters that allow them to go in a different direction without ever denying the history that mainline 616 has.
Yes, I guess maybe that's it then. For me, I think, and obviously we don't have a hard, a corporate dictionary of these terms or whatever, right? For me, I would say that line that you're describing, a hard denial of things that came before, that's a hard reboot. Whereas a soft one's like, you could talk about that. That's fine. But we're going to work around it. in like in the case of Snyder's Batman post New 52. You still had Dick Grayson, you still had Jason Todd, Damian was there, and Damian is the newest incarnation of Robin and would have been the most recent addition. So therefore would have had the hardest argument to not exist in the New 52, but they kept him anyway. I would argue Batman went through a soft reboot because they allowed Snyder to talk about and mold those things in with the story he was trying to tell.
In the reboot aspects of that particular example were the only things that was confusing about it, because there was that whole like 5-year timeline they talked about, where it's like, all right, well then how do you fit all those Robins in there, So that's where it was like, all right, well, even though New 52 was a hard reboot across the board, mostly across the board, the softer parts of it is what was confusing about the whole reboot in the first place.
Yeah, because they didn't fully commit. They didn't.
Yeah. They went
Which,
hog.
When you get a reboot, you guys want the full committal?
I think so. Yeah. Like I'm thinking of current Ultimate Comics.
I think if you're going,
Cale's having some things. There you go, Cale. Yeah. Spoke too soon.
Sorry.
I would say like current Ultimate Comics is a hard reboot of the Ultimate Comics. It's a whole new reimagining of what that is, and I think it's for the better.
I agree. I think you have it siloed, and that makes it clean. It makes it easy to be able to distinguish a before and a past. Whereas if you have stuff carry over and linger, it makes it a little bit difficult to discern what becomes important. Because I feel like that's something that we talk about is when discussing reboots, what stays important, what remains to be important. And if you have stuff that carries over, well then how can I actually say that this is going to be a reboot, or do I really actually have to go back and do my research? If it's a full commitment, okay, number one, I know that is number one. I start there and that's it. I build.
Maybe a hot take. I think that reboots should be off the table.
I think I agree in 98% of cases.
Of mainline universes, I think that they should be maintained, and you can retcon things, which we'll get to. You can do certain things like that, but I think a reboot is just too harsh of a denial. I would be very interested. There's no way to know this, but I would be interested in knowing how many people fell off of DC altogether when the New 52 came around, because all this history that you cared about and loved was suddenly, gone. And I know that they brought in a lot of new readers through the New 52. I know I ramped up my DC reading when that happened. But the fact is that there were a lot of people left out in the cold. If Marvel ever rebooted the mainline universe, I would have to really think about some things, because I just don't want that.
It has a potential of being a hard jumping off point for people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why Marvel has not done it.
Yeah.
They try to have their cake and eat it too with, legacy numbering, and which we have a whole separate video on that about. But I don't think they will do a hard. If they haven't done one yet, I don't think they're going to be doing one.
What would you call One More Day?
Story.
That is, I think it is, in my eyes, a relaunch.
Maybe a hard soft reboot.
I feel like it's a story. Like I don't think it's.
Yeah, but we're talking past that.
No, I get what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that I don't feel like it undoes something in universe for the characters, but it's not saying it did it. It's not saying, I don't know. Maybe I look at it wrong, but to me, it's not that it didn't happen. It is that it didn't happen, but I don't know. It's hard.
Sean, I get it. No, I get it, because chronologically, it all still happens. Like, it's not like Spider-Man never married MJ. Like, we're at the point where he recognizes One More Day happened. Like, there's an understanding there. So it's a continuation.
But that's a retcon.
it's not a retcon because they didn't go
It's not?
retroactively to correct it. It is
Okay.
continuing forward.
Okay.
That's why I was saying I think it's just a story, because
A
I do
retcon-
think it's
Okay.
just
Yeah, a retcon has since passed where Green Goblin and Gwen, we didn't know it at the time, but they had a thing going
Yeah,
on.
sure.
so yeah, I'm of the mind that a reboot is either going to be a hard or a soft one, but ultimately it's something that the big two would do well to not do. I think every year we say, will DC reboot
Yeah.
their universe? And thankfully they haven't done it in a while. I think going the absolute comics route, the ultimate style route, makes more sense. If you want flat land for new people to build on,
Yeah.
then sure, do it like that.
Yeah, the reboot, especially the hard reboot, should be like nuclear codes.
Exactly.
Like you got to have two people to turn the key. The president's got to carry the football case. Like,
Which is what they should be doing with Legion of Superheroes, in my opinion. But
yeah,
I
they have
don't
to
mind
cut
it
into
for
a guy before they. Anyway,
I don't mind reboots for teams or IPs, I guess, is a better word to put it, or concepts. But line wide, avoid them if you can.
Well, let's talk about what we consider to be one of the other R's, a retcon. Let's talk about what a retcon is. In my mind, because I feel like retcon is a word that a lot of people get twisted.
Mm.
In my mind, a retcon is when one of the two companies says, this thing that happened, it didn't really happen like that. What you thought you saw isn't what actually was occurring. Or we're going to fit something into the margins of what you know that alters your perception of what you saw.
People forget that retcon stands for retroactive continuity. They think retcon is its own thing. It has to be done retroactively to slide something else in.
Right.
that's what the entire Identity Crisis
Yeah.
book is about.
Yeah. And I think Since Past is the one that jumps into my mind immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Or I forget what it was, but that Howard Stark was a member of Hydra all along, or something like that. I think there was a run where somebody did that, where Howard was helping Hydra or something, where they went in the past and then that affected the future because they retconned something in the past. I feel like it always happens with Captain America. There's always a retcon of some point in World War II that we didn't know about that affects the future. But I think that kind of works for Cap because that's just the nature of the character.
Well, you bring up Captain America, and one of the best examples I can think of a retcon that is not a retcon is when Captain America Steve Rogers was revealed to be a member of Hydra. And everybody was so upset because they're like, whoa, they're retconning Captain America to have always been Hydra. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up with the lore. And it's like, well, that's because it's not actually a retcon, right? And it's people's misinterpretation of what they're reading that leads them to saying something like that that's just not true. An example of a retcon that I think was very damaging, and if you guys have one example, I would love to hear it. This is one that sticks out to me, is New X-Men. In Grant's New X-Men, Grant introduces Zorn. And the idea that Zorn, if I'm remembering this right, it's been a while, but the idea that Zorn was actually Magneto. Right? And that added layers to Magneto's character and why would he do this and all that stuff. But then when Grant left, they retconned it to where Zorn wasn't Magneto. And there was something completely different going on with that. And that's something that I feel like they've kind of I don't know where Zorn is anymore. But that retcon, among others that were done during that run, is why Grant hasn't worked with Marvel since. Because they've been that, I don't want to attribute the word bitter, but that hurt by Marvel's decision making in that instance.
I think one of the worst retcons is another Spider-Man is riddled with them, but it's the whole I forget the storyline of it, but it was the Aunt May stuff, where they had that Aunt May book that was I think written by Mark Miller, that showed that like her and Spider-Man's father might have had like an affair sort of going on. It was like the young versions of those characters. They were like sexy. It was kind of a romance book.
That was
Or
a different universe, wasn't it?
I don't think so. It might have been then retconned to be another universe. But while it was coming out, I think it was supposed to be like a story from the past. But I think a good one is Winter Soldier.
That was one ahead in my mind.
Yes. That's the best one, maybe.
Yeah.
I feel like the retcons are very few and far between for the stuff that I've read. I was gonna bring up the Winter Soldier piece, or if not the, or the whatchamacallit, the Swamp Thing, like becoming. It's no longer the bumbling man who has been transformed, but really the plant that has absorbed the mind, right? Like that's the extent to which I understand is they're typically in story, and they happen to serve some larger purpose, not for the sake of the continuity of a character, which I can feel can get frustrating.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
I think retcons have an unfair negative view on it because it's a storytelling device. I think it has been used poorly, and when it's used poorly, people remember it. But I do think it's a storytelling device that can be used well, like Winter Soldier, where I think it's a little misunderstood, as it's not just a negative.
Yeah. I agree with that. We see retcons obviously far more than we see resurrection, or I'm sorry, we see a lot more resurrections, but far more than we see reboots, hard or soft. And I think it's because a lot of times a writer might come in and say, hey, there's this idea I really want to do, but in order to do it, I need to go back in time and change something to make this work. Again, Winter Soldier, that is exactly that. We see how well that worked.
Green Lantern, the whole color core was a retcon, really.
Right.
That's not, he was, I think, magic based originally. And that completely rewrote a whole section of the DC universe, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about resurrections.
Jean Grey fan over here.
Okay. All right. If you want to lead with that, we can. So, a resurrection, I think we can all understand what that is. It's bringing a character back to life. It's probably the one that happens the most frequently, and I think it's the most divisive. Because there are a lot of people who feel that dead should be dead in comics. And when it's not, they get frustrated by that. Like if you were reading comics in the 80s, right? And you saw the death of Jean Grey, then how did you feel when she was brought back? And the death of Jean is an example of a resurrection and a retcon at the same time. Because Jean Grey was the Phoenix when she died. And she was on trial with the Shi'ar for having killed an entire planet's worth of people. It might have even been a solar system. The idea was that she murdered a lot of people and they were going to judge her. And so when she was killed, the idea was, well, we're not going to bring her back, right? We're not bringing her back. And a major reason why they wouldn't bring her back was because they didn't know how to have her be a hero again and justify the fact that she killed all these people, right? So that's when they came up with the idea that essentially the Phoenix was in control of Jean's actions and that Jean wasn't in control of herself. And I have always been very bothered by that because I think that it's interesting if Jean was maybe, influenced by this amazing power that she has, but not that she was taken over, that she was just a host. Like Eddie Brock and Venom, like Eddie is the host for Venom, but the fusion of them is what makes Venom. And they both act. And now they've essentially retconned that with Jean and the Phoenix.
They retconned her agency, which is annoying, especially for a female character.
Barry Allen was a character in a very similar sense, but sort of in the other end. He died in Crisis on Infinite Earths and, basically saved the galaxy, or the multiverse. And, he was never supposed to be brought back. Unless there was like time travel involved and you could see him in the past, whatever. But Jeff Johns brought it back. And it was through shenanigans. I don't remember the exact what's it, but through that there was the massive retcon of Barry's mother had died, and it was killed by the Reverse Flash, and that was a whole thing. But very similarly, like, it was always seen that if Barry came back, it would delegitimize his sacrifice, and would delegitimize Wally's time as the Flash, which, up to that point, he was the better Flash, and Barry was held up as this superhero saint.
And I'd argue bringing Barry back did that exact thing.
Yeah.
I'm a Wally head, so.
Yeah, let me ask you. There's a very similar situation with Green Lantern, yeah, where go ahead.
Well, Hal came back in a similar fashion, maybe 5 years previously, I think. But the thing was, when he died, he had turned evil. Basically, when funny enough, when Superman died and came back, the first appearance of Mongol was Mongol wiping out Coast City, and that drove Hal crazy. And so he couldn't resurrect Coast City with his powers, and so he took it to Oa and basically wiped out the entire Green Lantern Corps. And then he became the villain Parallax. Well, he died, if I'm thinking correctly, and the old heads will get me on this one. He died with Green Arrow in an event that I don't remember the name of. And then he became the Spectre.
Zero something?
0 hour.
0 hour.
0 hour,
Yes.
Spectre.
And then Hal Jordan became the Spectre. So
Whoa.
the Spectre attached itself to Hal Jordan, and basically for, I don't know, something like 15 years, Hal Jordan just kind of showed up whenever the Spectre needed something to do, or, there was other stuff that happened. So Hal was never really gone. The retcon came when Jeff made Parallax a corruption of the Green Lantern energy. And through that, Hal came back in the specifics. I don't remember the exact details.
It's similar to the Phoenix. Like, he wasn't really in control. It was the entity that was controlling him.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a little different for me because, one, Hal was evil at the time, but also he was never totally gone.
I think with that example and with the Phoenix example, fans get caught in the crossfire of that.
Yeah.
Because if you're truly connected to all these characters and stuff, if you're like, 16, the year that Jean Grey's killed by Chris Claremont and co. John Byrne, I think, was with him on that. If you're 16 when that happens, and then she gets resurrected, and it's like, oh, no. She wasn't bad. She was under control of the Phoenix. You're like, wait a second. That's not what I read. That wasn't in the comic book that I read. What are you talking about? And so I feel like, especially when you do a resurrection and a retcon together, it can be damaging to the legacy of that character in some cases. A lot of people will never love Jean Grey the same. And I think that character has had a hard time finding her footing because her story, and Jean Grey's my favorite character, her story was kind of told.
Yeah.
And not only
Yeah.
that, her second death then becomes less impactful because of that.
Her second death.
Yeah.
Second, how about third, fourth, fifth?
Sure, yeah. She's just
Any
fodder at that
subsequent.
point. Yeah. Well, that's why, like, now, like, we're reading as we record this, it's the end of the Krakoa era. The whole Phoenix stuff happening in that, it's just like, all right.
That's right. Thumbs down.
Your Mac
Right.
finally gave you the correct emotion.
Yeah, right. Worked for me for once.
So which of these, if you could choose only one, right? If you can choose only one to be gotten rid of, which one, Resurrection, Reboot, or Retcon, would you say is completely off the table for the big two? They can never do it again.
Resurrection.
I would say both Reboot and Resurrection.
One.
Reboot. Resurrections can be good sometimes.
Yeah, I would say reboot in that case. Give me the consequence of continuity.
Yeah.
I would also say Reboot. Because I feel like there are a lot of excellent examples of retcons being additive, and I feel the same way about Resurrections, but to me, hard reboots are just way too jarring for fans. And I also think that I can't speak to what it was like for Crisis. I wasn't there. I don't know how that impacted DC, but I know how the New 52 did. And it was way too gargantuan of a task, even for the creators involved and the editors involved, to manage that much. It's hard enough to do it when the wheels are turning just fine. But when you have to stop and start with something completely different, that's very difficult. And I think the proof is in the pudding with that one, where, you know, your mileage may vary, but ultimately the New 52 had a lot of flaws. So for me, take reboots off the table. But you know what? That ain't going to happen. Marvel and DC are going to continue to serve us a healthy portion of all three of those things. And it's up to us to figure out where we can accept it and, you know, how we get through this thing we love called comics. Which of those three, though, is the worst for you? And how do you feel about the fact that these are tools in the toolbox of Marvel and DC that they are never going to get rid of? Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you. We will see you in the next one. Until then, take care, guys.